Well, welcome to this edition of the Lynne Hayes Freeland Show. You know, there are so many ways that people describe our city. They call it the most livable city. They call it all kinds of things. But not many people have made the comparison between Pittsburgh, living in Pittsburgh, and living under apartheid, living in apartheid. In fact, calling Pittsburgh America's apartheid. Yeah, hasn't happened often, but that is exactly what Jerry Dickinson did in a recent article that he wrote. Jerry is with the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He joins us now. Jerry wears a bunch of different hats. I feel like we kind of need like constant graphics going through because in the last 2 years, I want to say, since we've gotten to know you, you've done all kinds of stuff, but this is what we're talking about today. Welcome to the show.
Right. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So before we make this connection, talk to me a little bit. How is it you spent time in South Africa?
Sure. About a decade ago, over a decade ago, I was a Fulbright scholar and a human rights activist in South Africa. So I was selected as a Fulbright scholar by the United States Department of State to go overseas to do research and to work as a lawyer and human rights activist and effectively represent the interests and constitutional rights of poor South Africans and those who were living in the slums and shanty towns of Johannesburg.
And having grown up here in Pittsburgh, you knew a lot about Pittsburgh prior to your trip to spending this time in South Africa.
Yes. Yeah. I'm born and raised Pittsburgh. I grew up out of the Allegheny County foster care system into a large foster home, grew up in the northern suburbs in Shaler Township, and then left the city of Pittsburgh and lived, overseas in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, lived in a lot of big cities. So my perspective on this entire question of apartheid really is coming from a lot of different angles and a lot of different perspectives.
And when you were there, when you were in South Africa, did you make that leap in your head? Was that the beginning of this connection for you, or did it come later?
It came later. I would say spent time in Johannesburg, but it was when I was back in Pittsburgh as a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives that I made the connection. It was 10 years later, of course, but
okay.
The time I had spent in South Africa, crisscrossing Johannesburg, living in the slums and the shanty towns, working on behalf of the poorest of the poor, representing their rights, I got a very intimate experience with understanding post-apartheid South Africa and the racial disparities that existed in Johannesburg after apartheid. So, for example, I learned very closely the levels of occupational segregation in post-apartheid South Africa between whites and blacks. I learned very closely the health outcomes between Black women and white women in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is one of the world's most unequal societies in Johannesburg in South Africa. And so I got this very on the ground kind of experience. And then when I came back to Pittsburgh 10 years later, I'm a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh, a community advocate, and now a candidate for US Congress. I'm crisscrossing the entire Pittsburgh region, doing the same thing, knocking doors, meeting families inside their homes, in their living room, having conversations about education, about housing. I'm literally seeing the segregation all throughout the Pittsburgh region. And that's when it dawned on me. I said to myself, this is not that different than post-apartheid Johannesburg. And that's when I drew the connection, was on the campaign trail.
So I guess for a lot of us, and full disclosure, I've never had the opportunity to go to South Africa. It's on my bucket list, but I haven't. And I don't know that many of us have that full understanding of life in post-apartheid South Africa, because I think that for many of us, after the fight, after the fall, we thought that life was going to be much different there.
Sure. Yeah. And post-apartheid South Africa, during apartheid, they had laws that, effectively what they called the Group Areas Act. And based off of racial classifications, based off of your race, you had to live in a particular district in a city. So they racial classifications based off if you were white, if you were a Black South African, if you were Asian, Indian. And they had another classification, which was called coloreds, COLOUREDS, coloreds.
Right.
And you were separated geographically. You couldn't actually go to certain parts of the city based off of your race. And they criminalized interracial marriage. They criminalized all kinds of different aspects of society. So these were laws that separated and segregated. We've never had that here in the United States in that type of capacity. But what we have had in Pittsburgh is policies and practices that have effectively created the same level of segregation and same level of racial inequality, even without those apartheid laws. And the confluence and history and decades of these types of policies in Pittsburgh have created effectively what I call, an apartheid city here in Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh. So now you're on the campaign, you're going door to door, you're meeting people, you're talking to them, you're introducing yourself to them. When does this light go off for you?
Yeah, I was in the Hill District, as I mentioned in the essay, and meeting families, knocking doors, having conversations. And specifically, the conversations were about housing and segregation and gentrification. So in the Hill District, for example, it's one of the most segregated neighborhoods in all of Pittsburgh. And I remember speaking with a family with 3 children. And I had this flashback because the 3 children that I saw when I was sitting on the porch and I looked through the window, I saw them, they were giggling, they were laughing at me, they were looking at me, 3 children, they're all 3 African-American children. That drew me back to a moment in South Africa when I was in Alexandra, which is one of the poorest slums of South Africa. And I was there playing with children after working alongside some community groups. And there was this moment when I just had this memory, this flashback. And I said to myself, these kids here in Pittsburgh, Black children, are growing up in the nation's most unequal city, which is Pittsburgh. And the kids in Alex, Black South African kids in Alex, who I had met in this slum in Johannesburg, they too were growing up in South Africa's most unequal city. And that moment, I said to myself, this is a problem. We have the same level of segregation, same level of racial disparities. Something's got to be done about it. And that's when I realized.
So we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to now unpack some of that, because where people live and what that segregation means has a lot of layers to it. And that's what I want to talk about when the Lynne Hayes Freeland Show continues. Don't go away.